like to address the following idea. Many of the questions had to do with the idea of demons being independent entities and were asked in that way. As we have just explained in the monologue, the idea of demons are simply a manifestational projection from the negative side of collective consciousness of humanity. So we would like to repeat the idea that they do not have their own independent existence apart from that collective consciousness, where, in a sense, when fear-based and negative beliefs take precedence in a person's consciousness, they can be crafted, so to speak, out of the energy of the collective consciousness on the negative side, formed, so to speak, from the clay of that negative collective consciousness, and are projections of any individual tapping into that negative collective consciousness to form the experience or reflection of a demon, and they are not independent entities in their own right. Therefore, that monologue has addressed all the questions that may have been asked in a way that implies that demons are independent entities, which they are not. So those questions are eliminated. They are already answered.
Okay, I'll do my best to avoid those. The first one has to do with the representation of the Lucifer archetype and the idea that there's an asteroid Lucifer in astrology that could symbolize how we might be influenced by darker energies or even be tied to unbreakable soul contracts. And what this person is asking for is a more empowering or positive view on how to understand and work with this archetype.
As you know, in your language, the name Lucifer actually means light bringer. So the idea, again, is that it reflects the concept of taking light in its highest form and reducing it energetically, vibrationally down to a physical level, lowering the frequency. This is what is meant by the concept of a fallen angel, that its vibrational frequency is reduced to such a degree that it expresses itself in physical terms at a lower density, a lower vibration. Now, this doesn't happen specifically to an actual angel, but the idea is representative and reflective of the idea of your higher natures, as you often say, the angels of your better natures, your true essential beingness, which is light and love, in a sense being lowered in frequency to be experienced and densified into physical materiality. So the idea of Lucifer is simply the idea of archetypally dealing with the polarity that exists in the way that it is expressed in physical reality between positive and negative, light and dark, so on and so forth. So it is that reflection which can bring up fears within an individual or within a collective and must be dealt with and transformed by turning it back into the light or balancing the darkness with the light within each and every individual.
Okay, thank you. And could you explain the concept of as above, so below when it comes to negative energy? When we experience wars, injustice, and dehumanization, what is happening above that it translates to these atrocities below?
The challenges on your life path are created in a spiritual blueprint that then play out in physical reality below, so to speak, in the denser reality of a lower frequency, but according to the belief system in the personality as to whether that is dominated by positive and or negative beliefs. So it's not necessarily that the blueprint itself contains the struggle or the strife that you experience in war and other kinds of experiences like that. But the challenges that are outlined in the life path blueprint are then colored by the belief systems in the physical personality to be experienced in ways that allow you to overcome those challenges relative to the physical personality point of view.
Okay, and can you speak about the demons or Satan that Jesus faced and those that archetype Archangel Michael faces?
Again, the idea is to understand that Yeshua or Jesus, just like you, understood the idea that demons are a projection of the collective negative consciousness of humanity. And it is simply a way of referencing that he, like you, had to deal with and transform and balance those energies within himself as a human so that he would balance them, face them, deal with them in a way that would allow him to transcend the idea of experiencing negativity for himself, but still outwardly would express that idea in such events as the crucifixion and the torturing and suffering to represent the idea of how humanity sees itself, how it represents itself, how it experiences itself in a negative way that can be transcended in a positive way by then the events of the upliftment, of the resurrection, and the ascension. The idea of archangels experiencing interactions with negativity is simply another way of saying that when angels deal with humanity, they recognize that that polarity exists, but they are, in a sense, above that and do not experience it directly for themselves.
And what exactly is black magic? Does it work? How? And why do some people practice it?
Again, this has to do with misconceptions of empowerment. It is the idea of utilizing synchronicity in a negative way. So the idea is simply another expression of polarity, recognizing one's self-empowerment for the creation and manifestation of certain events or effects in physical reality, but doing it from kind of a negative point of view, that one must proceed in the darkness in order to affect the reality or the life in the way that one intends or one prefers, rather than coming from the side of light.
Okay, and could you shed some light on the idea that people are possessed by demons, such as a nun crawling up the walls and the ceiling inside of a room, which was witnessed by a priest, or other such occurrences witnessed? How does an exorcist remove the demons from such people?
Again, this is happening internally. Remember that this is your own energy, and you are capable of manifesting many different kinds of effects, like levitation, crawling up walls, things like that, when the belief system is strong enough to allow those effects to occur and overcome what might be a typical understanding of physical reality, to demonstrate those abilities, to demonstrate those powers, but again, being done from the fear or negative based side. A possession is again a recognition that it is your own energy. That's why it's in your body. But it is the idea that it is coming from outside because you are in denial of the fact that you are creating the demonic force out of the collective negative consciousness. So the idea of possession is a sort of polarized way of understanding that it is your own energy, but through the denial that it's happening from you, so you project it on the outside, that you are being possessed by a demonic entity from the outside. But that is simply a convenient way of not facing the fact that you are actually creating this energy within yourself by going so deeply into the idea of negative and fear-based beliefs that it takes over your physical form to the extent that you can actually exhibit some of the features that you are talking about.
Can you talk about the idea of protection from negative energies and using things like crystals, flower essences, and other things to protect and create a positive energy field? How do things like that work? And does focusing on the idea of protection in any way create more of an idea of a threat and something to be protected against? Or can these things be explored in a positive and supportive way without calling all that in?
Yes, they can. Now, it's all well and good if you wish, and if it makes you feel better, to say that you are surrounding yourself with white light or using a crystal to clear the energies or sage to clear the energies of the room, so that you are using a permission slip to establish that you have a preference for a particular positive vibration, so that the idea is that you will not allow your energy to match the frequencies of something that you might deem to be a more negative idea or a negative belief system. So in that sense, yes, you can do that. But the overindulgence or the over worry of the idea of needing protection or requiring protection can in fact actually invite the idea of your energy matching more negative frequencies, because you are believing so deeply that you need the protection. You're actually creating the idea of the experience of being attacked, because you are believing so strongly that you might be attacked, thus believing very strongly that you need the protection, instead of doing it more lightly, just as a statement of the vibrational frequency that you prefer in your intentions toward all things and experiences in your life. So it's a matter of balancing that idea and using the permission slips in a lighter and more positive way, rather than steeping yourself in the fear that if you don't protect yourself, something might get you, which again is only going to be your own energy matching negative vibrational frequencies that would allow you to experience the effect as if you are being attacked by something outside yourself, when it's all going on internally. So again, it's a matter of balance.
So, along those ideas, let's say
One
someone lives
moment,
in a
one
neighborhood.
moment. To answer the previous question fully, the idea of an exorcist is really simply someone who allows them to get in touch, allows the person that appears to be possessed to get in touch with the fact that it is coming from their own belief system, and that they themselves are manifesting that particular experience from their own energy. So in a sense, an exorcist is sort of like a type of psychologist that can aid and assist a person to get out of denial that they themselves are creating that effect, and that demons don't really exist as outside entities, but that that person is that powerful that they can create that effect within themselves. But they have to own it, they have to take responsibility for it, and then they will find that they are no longer, quote unquote, possessed. So that's what an exorcist actually does, is use the person's belief system in the negativity to overcome it by their belief in the positive energy that is capable of overcoming it. But it's all, in a sense, deep psychology that puts a person in touch and out of denial of their own fear-based and negative belief systems.
Okay, that's great. And as far as the protection idea, for example, if someone is living in a neighborhood and suddenly they become aware that there's been a number of robberies, and then that person decides for their own protection to put an alarm system in or take some steps in order to increase their security. Is that fear-based, or in what makes that okay?
It is moderately fear-based, but at the same time, it can be done in a balanced way that simply recognizes the environment and the nature of the environment that you may be living in. So it's all right to be quote unquote practical and take certain precautions, as long as it doesn't become an obsession which could actually drive the negative experience toward you. So again, it's a matter of practical balance. It's a matter of understanding what environment you may have chosen to live in, so that you can take moderate precautions to simply make you aware and alert of what is going on around you with other people so that you don't necessarily have to pay that much attention to all the little details. It can do something for you to help you relax, to understand that then you can focus on other things by having taken a modicum of awareness, a modicum of protection in that context. But as long as it doesn't become a full obsession, then there is nothing to worry about.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Um, this question is, because we are afraid of our own light, our own infinite power, is this why our ego creates the idea of demons?
Yes. Exactly what we explained in the monologue.